Good evening. I'm Deborah Lucas. I'm the director of the MIT GCFP and a finance professor over at Sloan. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you who are here tonight, our presenters, panelists, discussants, our GCFP Distinguished Advisory Board members, and all our friends from the academic, practitioner, and policy communities. So welcome to the Golub Center's 4th annual conference. Even as the political landscape around the world is in flux, government financial products, policies, and institutions, the theme of our conference this year, continue with a great momentum of their own to have a first-order influence on the real and financial investments that societies make, on the types of financial products and services that households and businesses have available, and on the ability of private financial markets and institutions to efficiently operate and innovate. A core part of the GCFP's mission is to be a catalyst and forum for new research that informs financial policy. The themes that took place on tomorrow's program, that is the real effects of government guarantees, China's credit policies, and US mortgage market reform, are all clearly areas of major concern for financial policy. I'm truly excited about the quality of the presenters and papers that we've been able to bring together and look forward to some productive discussions tonight and tomorrow. But turning to tonight, we're starting off the conference with a panel discussion on risk management, which is another area where governments wield great influence, both as practitioners and as regulators. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ben Golub, the Chief Risk Officer at BlackRock and the Chair of the Golub Center's Advisory Board, who will moderate and speak on the panel and tell you more about it now. So please welcome the panel.
So tonight we have a panel about the challenges for risk management, and we have Andy Kuritzkes, who's the CRO of State Street. We have Tom Stanton from Johns Hopkins University and Edward DeSeve from the Brookings Institution. The format of this will be divided along the private sector people and the public sector people. And I'm going to be a dual role because wear a different hat, be the asset management guy. Andy will be the bank guy. And the three questions that we'll be addressing are: how are government policies determining the way financial institutions engage in risk management? Do those policies encourage effective risk management? And 3, where is policy most at odds with effective risk management, and what are your recommendations for policy changes that would make risk management more effective and efficient? It could be helpful to choose some specific examples that are most salient to you in your experience. For our colleagues on the panel from the public sector, we'll ask 3 slightly different questions. How should the risk management goals and challenges differ from those facing private sector risk managers? 2, beyond the most obvious political constraints, what are the impediments to more effective risk management in the public sector? And 3, what could be done to make risk management in government more effective? And are there examples of particularly good practices that could be implemented in other places? It would be helpful to choose some specific examples. So with that, let me turn it over to Andy.
Well, thanks, Ben. I'm honored to be invited to participate in what feels like it's July in the Riviera rather than September on the Charles, given the weather outside. So when I spoke to Ben about today's panel, he joked that I could go on all evening to talk about the questions that he posed, because they've really consumed my day life as Chief Risk Officer at State Street. So I'm going to address these questions from my perspective at State Street, which, in case you don't know, State Street's in a very restrictive club. We're one of 8 U.S. designated globally systemically important banks, which means that we have the privilege of being among the most highly regulated financial institutions in the United States. So what's true for State Street may not be true for other financial institutions, such as BlackRock, where Ben works, which are not bank regulated, but are subject to different forms of regulation. I'd also want to add a caveat. While I'm going to draw on Mike's perspective as State Street CRO, my remarks here today are entirely my own and do not necessarily reflect those of my employer. So the first question Ben put out is, how much are government policies determining risk management practices at leading global banks? And I'm going to explain the answer in terms of both a floor and a ceiling. So before the crisis, regulatory expectations set the floor for risk management practices. There were minimum standards that large firms were expected to exceed. And this was invariably the case, whether in terms of quantitative requirements for regulatory capital or qualitative expectations for risk governance processes or credit underwriting procedures. And to take a single example of where regulatory requirements set the floor, just think about the Basel capital requirements that were enforced before the crisis. Most U.S. banks, almost all U.S. banks, comfortably exceeded the minimum Basel capital requirements in the run-up to the financial crisis. The average Basel capital ratio for the top 20 U.S. banks at the end of 2007 was 11.7%, relative to a floor of 8%. So the top 20 U.S. banks on average maintained almost a 50% buffer relative to the floor. And in fact, Lehman's last reported regulatory capital ratio in the quarter before it failed was 16.1%. Lehman had more than 2 times the regulatory capital minimum pre-failure. So instead of Basel regulatory requirements, large banks determined how much capital they should hold based largely on their own internal economic capital models, which, as you can tell, differed widely from the Basel approach. So what's happened since the crisis? Since the crisis, the regulatory floor has become the new ceiling. And what do I mean by that? There was a conscious push by regulators to set new standards for risk management that exceeded best practice of even the largest and most sophisticated banks. And this is most vivid, I think, in the Fed's annual stress tests, or CCAR, which now sets the de facto standard for how much capital large banks need to hold. So for those of you who don't live CCAR day to day, CCAR introduces both a quantitative test for post-stress capital and a qualitative test of the effectiveness, in the Fed's mind, of a bank's risk management and capital planning processes. And in order for a bank to be able to distribute capital to shareholders, it needs to pass both the Fed's qualitative and quantitative hurdles. And the public record shows several instances where some of the largest U.S. banks have failed to meet one of these two, have failed the Fed's test on one of these two dimensions, and have either had to scale back a proposed capital distribution to meet the qualitative test. This happened to Goldman, JP Morgan, and Morgan Stanley in prior years when they exercised the so-called mulligan. So their original ask for capital distribution exceeded the Fed's allowance. Or 2, were prevented from making any capital distributions because of perceived weaknesses in risk management and capital planning processes. This happened some years ago to both Bank of America and Citi, as well as other banks more recently. So you can see that CCAR really is binding on large banks, both in terms of practice and quantitative requirement. And this same raising of the floor to the ceiling has occurred in many other parts of the risk management space. Just to cite a few: liquidity risk management, board-level oversight of risk practices, recovery and resolution planning, third-party vendor risk management, even procedures for model validation and what's called more broadly model risk management. In each case, the regulators have come up with new standards that go beyond where good and in many cases best practice was considered to be before the standard was adopted. And regulators, supervisors expect banks to conform quickly to these new standards. There's almost an immediate marking to market to the new regulation, the new expectation. Bank practices are examined routinely through regulatory examinations by on-site inspections. And wherever banks fall short, findings are issued requiring remediation, and in some cases, very accelerated remediation. So in short, compliance with these regulatory expectations has become the dominant focus for regulatory scrutiny of institutions like mine. Okay, so next question. Do these policies encourage effective risk management? The regulators have set new ceilings for risk management unabashedly and unapologetically. And their rationale is that the crisis was, above all, a failure of risk management. The regulatory community, I think, felt hoodwinked by the illusion of sophistication of risk practices at many of the world's largest financial firms that either went under, like Lehman, or became severely distressed during the crisis. And for those of you who are students of post-crisis reporting, this is laid out very clearly in the Rutledge report of international bank supervisors that came out shortly after the crisis. And I think the regulatory reaction can be characterized as a fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me response. And in short, the regulators are no longer willing to trust that risk managers are going to get it right based on their own firm's self-interest. And instead, they see risk management of our largest banks as a public good and therefore a national interest in setting risk management standards that are binding. So I have some sympathy for the regulatory reaction, and while I think the reaction is understandable, my own sense is the impact of this on the effectiveness of risk management is mixed. For the record, I think there's no question that risk management practices needed to be radically transformed to address weaknesses that were exposed by the crisis. And regulators played a critical role in forcing this to happen on an accelerated time frame. Nothing sharpens the mind like public rejection of a bank's capital plan for distributing capital to shareholders. But there are also costs, real costs associated with this heavy-handed regulatory approach. First, regulators don't always know what's best and won't always get it right. Too often, work in this standard setting goes on in the regulatory lab without input from practitioners. And while I have a lot of respect for my regulatory colleagues, they're missing out on a lot of brain power and practical experience in the market that could help lead to better solutions. Second, and more importantly, I think there's a very real crowding out effect. Risk resources are overwhelmingly focused on the regulatory agenda rather than on the firm's own risk agenda. And while the regulatory agenda is perhaps quite well suited to fighting the last war, given inevitable time lags, it's not dynamic or adaptive enough to anticipate the next battle or to switch metaphors to see the risks that are coming at us through the windshield. And then third, there's also a lemming effect. There's a systemic risk in conformity. And everyone adhering to the same regulatory standard is the opposite of letting 100 flowers bloom, and I think stifles innovation and the search for even better practice. So, last question, where is the divergence widest between regulatory approaches and effective risk management? I'll take two examples and then summarize quickly. So one example is a kind of macro top-of-the-house example. The other is a more micro example. My top-of-the-house example is regulatory requirements for board oversight of risk management. And our local Fed team told us that someone in the Fed had counted up that there were 600 individual requirements imposed on boards of directors related to risk management and oversight. Some of these were long outdated reporting requirements. Others are more substantive requirements for involvement in review and challenge and approval of things like CCAR or living wills. And the result was that boards, and particularly risk committees of boards, were overwhelmed by meeting highly prescriptive regulatory requirements. They were drowning in information that had to flow to them per these regulations. And there was a blurred line between board supervision and management. And I think a widespread view that the regulatory agenda was really being impeded, that the regulatory agenda was impeding effective risk management by boards. Now, to their credit, the Fed has recognized this, has woken up to this, and they've taken the initiative very recently to propose new regulations which would go a long way towards restoring the proper role of the board. It would reassert the board's role, that the board's role is to supervise, not manage. It would streamline a lot of these reporting requirements and hopefully allow enough room for boards to take control of their own risk agenda. Another example of overkill, in my view, is the Fed's requirements for model risk management in a policy issued in 2011 called SR 11.7. To those of us who follow this stuff, the Fed and other banking agencies established cradle-to-grave requirements for the validation and monitoring of internal models. These requirements apply not only to a firm's risk and regulatory models, but also to models used by the business for things like pricing or customer acquisition models. In fact, any analytical process that results in a quantitative estimate is within the scope of this guidance. And suffice it to say that the guidance goes well beyond what was prevailing best practice, and no firm fully complied with the model risk guidelines. And I think this raises a question of whether such highly prescriptive requirements for things like model validation are necessary. Why don't we allow firms, why don't we trust firms to have the self-interest, to have their own self-interest in accuracy of their models and design validation approaches that are fit for purpose? So to conclude, I think the broader point here is that the time has come for the pendulum to swing back on regulatory standards, especially standards such as model risk management, in areas that are not vital to safety and soundness, like arguably capital and liquidity are. Firms should be, in my view, allowed much more latitude to devise their own approaches that fit their risk profiles and business models. Doing so would lead to more experimentation, and I think possibly better outcomes within a single activity like model risk management. But more importantly, it would allow firms to decide how much process is enough and to deploy resources more efficiently towards higher risk priorities. So the bottom line is, while we shouldn't have total faith in firms to get risk management right on their own, we also shouldn't trust the government to get it right for them. Thank you.
And so now I'm wearing my asset management hat. And like Andy, while my remarks are certainly related to my experience as the CRO of BlackRock for a very long time, these are my own views as opposed to the firm's view. So to some extent, I listened to Andy's talk, and I said, well, I get what he's saying, but he already was dragging a wagon, and if they put a little bit more weight in the back of the wagon, you toughen up, you suck it up, you do it. And I was an asset manager. I was a free bird. I just did whatever I wanted to do. And in fact, BlackRock's claim to fame, if you like, in its beginnings was that we actually took risk management really seriously, and we devoted a real lot of resources, way above any kind of requirement, because frankly there weren't a lot of requirements. So when suddenly people start telling us, gee, we think you should do risk management differently than the way you're doing it, our initial response was we didn't like that. And we didn't like it a lot, and who are these people to tell us what to do, and why are they doing this thing, and we're kind of really busy, we're managing a lot of money, we don't have time for this. That strategy, that was not a winning approach. I had a discussion many years ago with the FSA, which was what the regulator in the UK was called at the time, and they were very obsessed with the notion that we needed to have a capital model for our business. And I didn't know exactly what that would be, because we don't actually use any capital in that business. We invest other people's money, we don't invest our own money. And then they said, well, you could be making operational errors and all sorts of things could happen. So we need you to statistically figure out how much capital you need for these strange events. And I am an MIT alumni, like many of you, and what they were asking us to do, in my mind, was intellectually dishonest at the highest level. And I said, you know what, I think it's a pile of nonsense. We're just not going to do that. Well, they increased our capital requirements very significantly, and next year we got someone else to talk to the regulator, and we built that model, which is ridiculous. But it's done to specifications. It has, in my opinion, no intellectual meaning whatsoever. We spend a whole lot of money doing it. but we do it. So it's a little bit of a flavor of coming at the world from a completely unregulated perspective towards risk management with a deep commitment to trying to do it right. And what does it mean to be told what to do? I think in general, a risk manager at an asset management company should be pretty aligned with what regulators would want, in the sense that we are, as risk managers, looking out to make sure that we're respecting the fiduciary obligations, the fiduciary needs of our clients, and be transparent and basically deliver what we say we're going to deliver. So there's nothing intrinsically about that which would be in violence. There's no competition that if we somehow or another have different regulations, our capital will be allocated in some kind of different way, things of that sort, because, again, it's not a capital intensive business. Okay. We're spicing up the talk a little bit. I do think what changed in the asset management world and how people thought about it was post-crisis, people were concerned about stability. And there are a lot of debates, and reasonable men can have different opinions about what the role of an asset manager is in financial stability, but certainly that was one issue. But a lot of the regulatory energy came not just from the point of view of financial stability, but to some extent it was, I called it sort of thinking by regulation by analogy, that the people who were in the regulatory business for the most part came out of the banking world, and they just kept on looking at the asset manager and seeing a bank. So there was a big debate, for example, is an asset manager systemically important or not? Reasonable men can differ. I certainly have a strong point of view. But a lot of the issues that are, I think, very compelling in the context of a bank become, at best marginal in the asset management context, particularly because the asset manager isn't the asset owner. And there is this other entity who's telling the asset manager what to do and not to do, and their opinion matters. I for a while, made a point when I would meet a client, I would always ask them at the end of the meeting, by the way, just checking, the money that we manage for you, do you think it's your money or our money? And I'm an empirical guy, and I have to tell you, 100% of the people I spoke to were very convinced that their money was their money. And so again, so with respect to this issue of whether or not we control the money or not, we operated under a fairly strict set of rules, and those rules could be changed at any time. And if we don't follow those rules, that money can be pulled away from us. And in fact, in terms of this whole notion of like a living will, how does that work? Well, even the best asset manager knows how it works, because you are constantly having clients tell you to hit the road, and they take their money back, and it happens in a very clean, almost mechanical way. They basically tell the custodian, don't take trades from manager A, it's now going to be controlled by manager B. So it happens, it's pretty seamless, it's exercises all the time, and it's not, it's disappointing if you're an asset manager, certainly, but it's not anything out of the ordinary. But nevertheless, there was substantial impact in terms of this bank-like thinking applying to the asset management business. So we happen to have at our firm a group of people who look at the counterparty risk, and making sure that the people we are transacting with are creditworthy. And we happen to have probably more people doing that kind of work than the next 5 of our competitors combined, would be my guess, because we're very careful about it. Nevertheless, the OCC, when they come to regulate BlackRock, and you say, the OCC, why do they do that? They do that because some of our investment management is done through a trust company. So the trust company doesn't take deposits, it doesn't make loans, but it does manage assets. And the credit reviews that we get of our counterparty activities are akin to what would happen at a bank. And for people who think we are beyond paranoid about counterparty risk, we're being held to standards which is very hard to interpret making sense, because we're not a bank and we're not lending to also the thousands of counterparties that typically a bank would interact with. So in terms of the heightened regulatory attention and scrutiny, post-crisis, there's been a huge amount of changes. We actually, one of the first things we had to create was what we call a Regulatory Oversight Committee. And the Regulatory Oversight Committee's job was to keep track of all the regulations coming in from all the regulators around the world and just make sure that someone was on it, because these regulations follow a clock, and we didn't want to be in a position to say we didn't comply because we didn't actually pay attention, didn't realize you came out with this regulation, because we're dealing with the other 75 regulations which are simultaneously going on. So the tremendous amount of activity. Most recently there's rulemaking done by the SEC with respect to liquidity. It's called Rule 22E4, and we're being asked to report information about mutual funds in terms of the assets and the liquidity of them, and the days to liquidate, and all sorts of very complicated parameters. Sounds very interesting. You can even understand why you might want to do that. We just don't know technologically and analytically how to do that properly. So the requirements are there. They are probably outside the range of well, I'd say state of the practice, state of the art, given the data that's available. In fact, one of the ironies, there is data in the corporate bond market through a system called TRACE. And TRACE is run by FINRA. FINRA in turn is controlled by the SEC. And there are regulations governing what data FINRA can release about the transactions in the corporate bond market, which in effect make it very hard to then determine statistically what the actual liquidity is in the market, because the data has to be dithered due to the FINRA requirements. So you've got the same regulatory chain of command, in effect, in one hand, demanding tremendous amount of transparency and accuracy in what they want, and then the other hand, basically saying the only data available to do that can't be released in a form that shows the true quantities of transactions, because we want to protect privacy. So these are examples of real impediments. The third thing which I wanted to mention with respect to regulation, we spoke about it a little bit at the advisory meeting of the center, which was before this, which is what I call the deglobalization of regulation. And I can speak for the institution I've been with for the last 30 years. We started out with the concept that we were going to manage money as best as we could. We were going to have a lot of intense risk management focus on it, and we were going to sell those products where people wanted to buy them. So manufacture and distribute was the model. But post-crisis, and it's very easy to understand why this is the case, when it came time to bail out banks and things of that sort, the markets were suddenly not global, they were very local, and local institutions and local governments wound up paying the tab for some of the failed financial institutions. But what arose from that was then a demand by the local jurisdictions to say, well, if we're going to pick up the tab, be the residual claimant, we want to be able to know that there's capital in place, we want to know that there's regulation in place, we want to know that there's substance in place, and we want to know what these people are doing in our jurisdiction. And that didn't just affect banks, it affected asset managers. So we wound up having to create another layer of risk management at BlackRock, which was separate and distinct from the risk management done to make sure that we manage the portfolios properly, because we need to have, we distribute certain kinds of instruments through Luxembourg, and we distribute other kinds of instruments through Dublin, and some through Paris, and in various countries in Asia. And there's a demand saying you need to have substance in your jurisdiction. You can't just be a PO box. And we want to have, and we consider substance having a risk manager. So we have 15 people in Luxembourg, and I've got 2 risk managers sitting there and we manage, of course, no money in Luxembourg. And got really smart people, and they're following instructions of what the regulators demand them to do, and they have to go through and do certain kind of VAR model testing and things of that sort. As far as the regulator is concerned, the only person they care about is that person in Luxembourg. I actually don't exist as the chief risk officer of BlackRock. I'm just some guy, which actually is not such a bad thing in terms of my day-to-day life. But there's an increasing amount of this deglobalization, which creates impediments to efficiency. It raises the cost of doing business. And in some cases, the regulations can be at odds with each other or similar but not identical, and it creates confusion. We have to report what are called thresholds. How much do we own of securities in a particular jurisdiction? So we might own, X billion dollars of German securities and Y billion dollars of French securities, et cetera, et cetera. But the rules in terms of how they're defined are extremely arcane. And in one place you count the convertible bond, in one place you don't count the convertible bond. Or if you have it but you don't vote it, you count it differently. And there are very ferocious penalties for not complying. And, on the one hand, it's very, very difficult. On the other hand, we say, well, if it's making us choke, it must be killing the competitors, because we think we're really good at this, and it's just killing us. So this challenge of the regulatory changes has consequences, creates a certain amount of inefficiency. So the second question was, do these policies encourage effective risk management? In some cases, some of the activities, some of the regulations probably are helpful in the sense that, we have an agenda, we have a certain amount of resources that we devote to these problems, and suddenly, if we had some project that we wanted to do in the risk management part of the firm, and the SEC says, gee, you really got to do liquidity stuff, and we wanted to do the liquidity stuff anyway, then it goes straight to the front of the line. So in that respect, there have been a number of situations where using if you like, the wind behind my back of the regulations, it's been positive. In other cases, it's actually very, very difficult, because the types of people and types of mindsets that we've historically liked to have in the risk management function, tend to be quantitative folks, but also creative kind of people. And when you overlay this notion of it being a regulatory process, you lose a lot of discretion, you lose a lot of judgment. You're going to run that test even if it's a day before Christmas and there's no trading in the market. You have to submit it at a certain point of time. So you wind up having, in effect, a compliance mentality having to be brought and overlaid upon the risk management process, because the free-thinking risk management, the eclectic kind of people, the people who stick their nose under the tent and ask all sorts of difficult questions, that's fine and well, but you got to bang out that report and you got to deliver it every day a certain way to a certain calculation. So in that respect, I think it's been a negative. And the way we've dealt with it is we've created a sort of a regulatory risk management function, which is technically part of the risk management team, but it's a different sort of culture, because the folks who are able to bang it out every day and get it exactly right and follow the rules and be very precise, very important, but it's a very different head. And we found that when we tried to impose that structural compliance-minded risk management on sort of the more economic risk managers, it was utterly demoralizing for morale. We actually lost a bunch of people who said that this is not what they wanted to do with their life. So those are some examples. Where is the policy most at odds with effective risk management? Temperamentally, I think mentioned that. There are issues where some of the regulations in different jurisdictions are older than other ones. So, for example, the UCITS regulations in Europe for mutual funds is simply a much more modern and advanced framework than there's a reason why they call it the 40 Act, and do the math. It's been like 77 years already. That's a challenge. I would agree with Andy. The model risk management issue has actually begun to enter into our domain. There were years when we first started the company that the model risk policy was that we don't do model risk management because we want to be in the position to upgrade and change our models very, very quickly for changing market conditions, and that when we balance the risks of being more rigorous and having a secondary review of model and slowing down our responsiveness versus the risk of having a model which was stale and not relevant to the market, our policy was we were going to choose to have the more dynamic risk management framework than the more structural one. Needless to say, we don't have that policy anymore. And it is not without any, model risk management has some validity to it, but again, I think, and here I probably get off easier relative to Andy because of the nature of the models that we have, because while we have the same rule, we have fewer models which are involved in sort of enterprise level or capital related. We had to actually validate that bogus model that I told you about capital. It very perfectly does a ridiculous calculation. But so it impacts us not quite as severely, but we've sort of threw in the towel and we've actually hired a whole bunch of people. And we're doing that. So that's an area where the resources probably could be spent better elsewhere. Thank you.
So I'm the bridge person between the private sector that we've heard about and government. And actually, that was my experience. I served on the staff of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission and was a point person on governance and risk management. And what I learned there convinced me that there were important lessons to bring to government. And so I'm going to answer three different questions. Actually, I should say one other thing. When we were at the FCIC, we had a marvelous risk paper from Golub and Crum, right? About an 85-page paper that really helped us think about risk management from the beginning. And also I ran across Andy because we found a wonderful analysis of shortcomings of Bear Stearns risk management done by Oliver Wyman. And as I understand, that was Andy's marvelous piece of work, and we learned a lot from that. So thank you. So the first question is, how do or should risk management goals and challenges differ from those facing private sector managers? And here I want to talk about enterprise risk management in government, because that seems to me to be something that is on top, preferably with a light touch, of all of the kinds of risk management that government does, credit programs, scientific programs, whatever, and Ed will talk a lot more about that. And enterprise risk management in government, let's boil it down. There's some more formal definitions. What are the risks that can prevent our agency from accomplishing its mission? And in my view, the difference, a major difference between the public and private sectors is that when you're in the private sector, particularly in finance, you can quantify a lot of your risk issues. This goes back to Frank Knight and the difference between risk and uncertainty. And in government, there are just a tremendous number of uncertainties that have got to be dealt with. And where you can quantify risk in the Frank Knight sense, in the uncertainty sphere, you need good judgment. And of course, in the financial crisis or afterwards, when we interviewed, we found some examples, and this is the ideal, where you combine both. So we interviewed David Vinier, the CFO at Goldman, and they talked about how their models yielded a certain liquidity cushion, and then it went up through the line, and each person added more till they were finally at about 50% more than their models would have suggested. And in government, look at the kinds of unquantifiable issues you deal with. How much is Congress going to cut my budget and when, for example? There are just tremendous number of variables that you've got to deal with. The one similarity I found between the financial crisis and the successful firms and government is the critical aspect of the flow of information up and down the hierarchy and across the silos. And in the case of JP Morgan, that avoided the worst of the financial crisis, in October of 06, they reported much higher delinquencies than they had been expecting. This went up the line. There was a tremendous discussion, and they found out our delinquencies, in fact, are lower than our competitors. You know, what is this all about? And you analyze it, and instructions went down to another part of the organization, dump subprime. And in Goldman Sachs, it was very similar. They had a model that should have shown they were making money, and for 10 days they were losing money. And so again, the information went up the line, and we interviewed Dan Sparks, the head of the Goldman mortgage desk. He said people came down from the top of the building he had never seen before, looking over his shoulder. What do you do? How do you do it? What's going on here? And then the instruction to Goldman, an investment bank, was to get closer to home, get short on the market. And this kind of information flow is critical in government. And in my view, the function of the chief risk officer in government is to facilitate the flow of information to decision makers who need it. And then the CRO can do the analysis and then facilitate deliberations of a risk committee because you have scarce resources. Enterprise risk management has to be light touch. So you don't want to have all of the little risks. Government ties itself up in red tape looking at all the little risks. You want to know the big ones that are really going to hurt you. And then you dedicate your scarce resources of people, money, and management attention to fixing that. And the bottom line, and this was in your paper, and it's true with tone at the top is everything. And of course, in government, tone in the top is really hard to maintain when you've got new people coming in all the time. The Defense Logistics Agency had a wonderful risk management system because there was a 3-star who basically said, we're going to do this. We had the chief risk officer write a great chapter in a book a friend and I edited on risk management in government. And then the 3-star left and somebody else came in and we're not interested in this, and it was gone. So tone in the top and the political change makes it very difficult. So that gets to the second question. Beyond the most obvious political constraints, what are the impediments to more effective risk management in the public sector? When I talk to agencies, and I go around and for years I've interviewed agencies, you interview people down in the middle of the organization someplace and there are all these problems and this is going on and that's going on, whatever. And then you interview people at the top, and everything's great. And it's like there's this layer of cork so that information just doesn't get up to the people who need it. And that happens because you've got special assistants who want to keep bad news from the boss, or you've got powerful barons who are heads of line units who basically say, hey, you know, I run a good unit here, don't bother me, and I don't want information to go to the boss. You know, why should he or she worry about it? So you have that in the private sector. We saw it with AIG Financial Products that walled off the chief risk officer, but I think it's much more prevalent in government. In both the public and the private sectors, the failure mode of risk management is that it becomes a gesture rather than a reality. And we saw this with Basel II, which basically said to all of these big, large, complex financial institutions, you can have really high leverage if you have risk management. And the response was, great, we've got risk management, here's a risk officer, and we know whom to hang if something goes wrong. And it was a total gesture. Well, in government, you can have that again. And you've got to be really careful not to turn enterprise risk management in government into a compliance exercise. Because the minute you want me to comply with enterprise risk management, great, I'll comply. It's got to be a flow of information. It's got to be an organic and a dynamic process. The third question, what should be done to make risk management in government more effective, and are there examples that I can give? Here are 4 ideas. The ideal with enterprise risk management would be if the Office of Management and Budget, not on the management side, there are 2 different offices in OMB, but on the budget side, would have serious conversations every time an agency's budget comes up. So the budget examiner would say, great, we see this, we know how much money you want. Now, what are the risks that are going to stop you from getting there? And to have that conversation, and in fact to reward it at times, because it would really benefit us as a country if somebody says, yeah, we got this really big problem and we need more resources, we can't deal with it, that OMB actually would allocate more resources to deal with the problem. We saw after the Benghazi consulate debacle where we lost an ambassador, that immediately Congress went in and decontrolled accounts because we knew we weren't spending enough on security of our overseas missions. Another issue, we live in an age of retrenchment of many, if not all, public services. OMB needs to recognize what I call capacity risk, which is the growing gap between capacity of agencies and the goals they're expected to address. You simply can't pretend, as the marvelous saying goes, that government should do more with less. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but that better be an analytic statement, not a statement of ideology. If we look at debacles like the loss of the 2 space shuttles, again, the ambassador in Benghazi, the OPM cyber breach, and now naval accidents in the 7th Fleet, in each one of these, there's a budget element where capacity has been stretched to the limit. And people, you can't pretend you're going to cover the whole waterfront. You've got to focus on the most important parts of the waterfront, and OMB has got to play a role in helping agencies recognize it. Third, if information flow is critical, which is my personal judgment, there's a marvelous federal employee viewpoint survey, question 17, which asks, I can disclose a suspected violation of any law, rule, or regulation without fear of reprisal. At the federal government as a whole, it's a mediocre 60% say yes. OMB should be monitoring agencies and that number as a performance outcome. In other words, instead of drilling down on a compliance exercise, you've got to have risk management. Start to get the agencies to look at that number and basically induce them to do whatever it takes to increase the number so there's the trust that people have in their line managers so that you can get that flow of information. Finally, enterprise risk management, it's been a big enthusiasm. OMB came out with a new circular, so every agency's rushing out hiring consultants doing enterprise risk management. In my view, a lot of those efforts are going to fail because it's not an organic exercise. The Rural Development Mission at Department of Agriculture reached out and asked me to help them, and I spent a year working with their senior executives and their political appointees to convince them why this was important. And it started out with a meeting of the 32 senior executives and political appointees. And I would tell them stories like Veterans Health Administration had this debacle with VA hospitals, and Congress started doing surgery on senior executive protections. The IRS had a debacle in their Cincinnati office with exempt organizations, and Congress ruthlessly slashed the IRS budget. You don't want that to happen here, And reputation risk is an immediate concatenation in Washington from all sorts of operational failures that can take place. You want enterprise risk management because that's going to save you and your agency and let you do what you need to do. So those are my 4 recommendations. I think enterprise risk management can work in government. But what we saw, let me close with another example from the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. Among all the other regulations that the government tried to impose was one that said we want living wills from these large, complex financial institutions. And so you want a living will, how we're going to sort of wind ourselves up under pressure? Here are 4,000 pages you can look at. And then I interviewed, and unfortunately it was an off-the-record interview, the treasurer of a really good company, financial firm. And she said, oh yeah, living wills, we use that. We can really understand our business better and the interrelationships when we think that through. The difference between enterprise risk management getting done well, which is the only time it's useful, is when you've got that mentality, we can use it to help ourselves. The minute it turns into a compliance exercise, you get a lot of perfect models. What was your line? Perfect models producing nonsense. So thank you very much.
I am very impressed with the way everybody answered the questions. I think it's really good. I've been a teacher for many years, and I value, did they get all the questions? And they answer, if they miss a question, you have a big problem. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to answer the first question, and in answering the first question, I'm going to try to fill in the answers to the other 2 questions. I'm going to do an essay instead of kind of a true-false or objective answering question. The first question is, in the federal government, what is the difference between private sector and public sector risk management activities? And my first answer is scope. The scope of the risk management activities that have to be undertaken by the federal government is mind-boggling. I put them in 4 categories, and the first category is very simple, simply managing the risk to others. We see our friends at EPA, our friends at the Atomic Energy Commission, our friends at the SEC struggle mightily with how to measure the risk to others and then how to control it, how to put models in place or how to put activities in place to do that. There is no central repository of information or ideas for those agencies. Nobody tells the AEC how to do this. The Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, in the Office of Management and Budget, and we're very close to Cass Sunstein's house here, somewhere in Cambridge, so I have to be a little careful when I talk about OIRA. Cass ran OIRA during the Obama administration. But OIRA will be the referee. I remember my friend Sally Katzen, when she ran OIRA, had to deal with the risks of frozen versus hard-chilled chickens. And the folks in Arkansas didn't want to call them frozen. They wanted to call them hard-chilled. So she spent meeting after meeting after meeting with the agriculture people and the labor department people and EPA people, getting a definition of what a frozen chicken was, what a hard-chilled chicken was, and how the health risk of that might or might not be interpreted and explained to the general public. That's the difference. It's that kind of scope of activity that we get into in those areas. So there's no central guidance for the agencies. There is a referee that tries to bring cost benefit and other good principles to play, but they aren't always successful. As the question mentioned, other than the political difference, what's the difference? The difference often is the political difference. When I was running the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act for President Obama, daily they were shooting at me. There were bombs that were incoming along the way. Stephen Colbert was pillorying me because of my name. He called me DeSeve. He said, "You're DeSeve. You're deceiving the country." And so there I was, having to take not just the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, not just managing $800 billion along the way. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So the scope and the intensity of scrutiny of what goes on, and any mistake is significantly amplified. If the first kind of risk that we manage is the risk to others, the second is very often financial risk. We have one of the largest mortgage institutions in the country in Fannie Mae, or in FHA. That's within the federal government. Doug was the CFO at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as was I. And of course, we all know that Henry Cisneros is the man who caused the crisis in the mortgage industry. This story was reported in the New York Times. Henry, a guy named Bruce Katz, who's now at Brookings, myself, Nick Ratsinas, who's actually here at Harvard, sat around the table one day talking about how to increase homeownership. And Mike Stegman, who was also there, was the head of policy development and research, said, well, if for the best customers, we just lower the down payment and lower the amount of documentation necessary, we can speed the process of giving mortgages and have more homeowners. Henry thought that was a good idea. He was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development at the time. He went to see the Vice President, who was doing a reinventing government thing, and the Vice President thought it was a great idea. And so for the best customers at FHA, we did that. Well, the mortgage market saw that. Again, there's a story about this in the New York Times. Saw that and said, well, if FHA can do it, we can do it. And the rest is history. So the idea that the smallest little activity you can take the butterfly wing movement within government in terms of the way you run your own financial institution, FHA, can then be magnified is incredible. When we came into office with Bill Clinton, I was a CFO at HUD and then the controller and deputy director at OMB. We said, look, the banks are screwing us. The banks are screwing us in student loans. They're taking federally guaranteed paper, making an enormous amount of money on it, and charging students a lot of money. We're going to be in the direct lending business. We're going to start doing direct loans through schools. Well, you would have thought we'd taken milk out of the diet or something. We just, said that you can't slice your bread or something like that. The banks just came down on us like a ton of bricks. We persevered. Congress was with us at the time, and we created the direct lending program. I don't know right now what the current market share that direct lending has. Probably 80%, somewhere in that range. Do you know? 100% of new ones, okay. So there's still some guarantee loans out there. So we went from having probably 10 or 15% of federal direct loans to the notion that we were going to come out and issue all of them through the Student Financial Assistance Program. Along the way, we had to figure out how to value the cost of these loans. Now, you'll love this. Right now, Student Financial Assistance is a negative subsidy program. What does that mean? It means it makes money. We set the rate, and again, Deborah and I might differ on this. We have to talk about this more, about where the true cost of the program lies. Does it lie in the fact that we increase the cost of the loan to the public? We certainly don't increase it more than it was increased under the guarantee system, I don't think. Has anybody done an analysis of that? I don't know. I think under the guarantee system it cost more than it costs now, but I could be wrong about that. Yeah, okay. So we lowered the cost of the student, but we also set something up where we actually make money along the way. However, we're not using good risk management principles, in my opinion. I talked to them some years ago about trying to bring in the fair value concept into student lending, and they didn't want to hear that at all. They wanted to stay with the credit reform law that's out there, which I think is a leaky sieve. But it's for another day. So we have risk to others, we have our own financial risks, and we don't do a good job, in my opinion, of managing those financial risks internally. We don't act as a bank would otherwise act. The third kind of risk is operational risk. Here we've talked about NASA, we could talk about the Coast Guard, we could talk about the Census Bureau. In 2010, as Nancy Potok, the former Deputy Director of Census, would tell you, it was a near-run thing about whether we're going to get the census done on time properly. Some of the issues in setting up large computer systems and the methods of enumeration were not gelling, were not coming together. So the census, as a lesson learned out of the 2010 program, set up for 2020 the beginning of a risk management program that is very robust. Tom's not sure whether it's going to work or not. We'll see. Nancy has left census and she's now at OMB. She hadn't left the government. But the idea that it would have been possible to run the census program without a risk management program is stunning. As Tom mentioned, only recently has the federal government required that agencies engage in operational risk management. We call it enterprise risk management, and for those agencies that are financial agencies, obviously, not just operational risk management, but also the financial risks that they face must be put in place. They also, however, I'm going to go backtrack to number 4 and then come back to number 3. They also have to deal in many cases with the existential risks. Again, that's another area of scope. It's a flood, it's a hurricane, it's a missile from Korea. These are other elements of risk that go beyond operational. It's beyond the things that people do every day. It's what might happen out there. The Coast Guard has developed something they call strategic foresight. There are others, especially in the national security area, who talk about strategic foresight. It goes beyond strategic planning. It's not just the kind of operational planning that we do under the Government Performance and Results Act. Rather, they're looking at 10 and 20 years at the potential effects of climate change on cities, coastal areas, harbors, and what that might mean for them. What kind of staffing do they have to begin developing now? What kind of a fleet do they need to begin developing now so that they'll be able to deal with that? I have a little mnemonic, or whatever you want to call it, that SF, strategic foresight, equals results, risk, and resilience. SF equals R3. It's my model. It's pretty sophisticated. Strategic foresight is something that more and more agencies are starting to realize. If I don't think about the consequences of an educated workforce, when you go to the Davos, the Global Risk Report that Swiss Re and Oliver Wyman and some other people put out every year, the uneducated nature, especially of males in the workforce, is one of the greatest threats to world stability and world peace. And we see that, obviously we see that in ISIS and the Taliban and other places. How does the Department of Education, how does the Department of Labor, how does the Department of Commerce, how do they get state governments to pay attention seriously to the long-term issues, the strategic issues that are out there, when operationally they have to deal every day with a tremendous amount of oversight from Congress, especially from the other party, if the other party doesn't like them, whoever that other party is. So operationally, we've begun integrating. You were dropping some wonderful acronyms. We now have OMB Circular A19. I know you all wait for every August to get a chance to read that. It comes out every August. It's good vacation reading. A19 has begun to integrate not just instructions for how to prepare your budget, but also for how to manage your agency in an integrated way. Strategic planning being one of them, risk management being another of them, along with the elements of results that we have to have. But we all too often ignore the whole idea of resilience. Judy Roden has written a wonderful book on resilience that I recommend to everyone, where she talks about the need to build resilience planning into your thinking. What if the fit hits the sham? What are we going to do? We really don't do that at all in the federal government well, except in a few agencies. I talked about existential risks earlier. We're in the middle of tremendous hurricanes in Texas, Florida, Georgia, and now Puerto Rico. When George W. Bush and Michael Brown dealt with Katrina, the organizational model that they used was command and control. In fact, the governor of Louisiana at the time called this posse comitatus. That means a posse was coming to tell us what to do, and they didn't like it. They said the Constitution prohibits this kind of activity. And that was the kind of conversation you heard. And Michael Brown, of course, was removed. After he'd done such a good job, he was let go. It's like that in the federal government a lot. Thad Allen was brought in. Admiral Allen was the commandant of the Coast Guard. He is a network manager. He learned early in his career that putting together people with a common mission, having a series of very clear objectives laid out for them, is the way to get things done. So what you're now seeing in Houston, when you looked at the visual in Houston, what you saw was the mayor was in charge, but the guy from FEMA was over his left shoulder, he had his congressional delegation over his right shoulder, and you watched as they, in an integrated way, ran the Houston deal. Now, the mayor is now calling for more resources. Of course, that's what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to say, we need more money, we need more money. He's supposed to do that. But while the flood was going on, he was saying, we're getting the cooperation we need. We have the resources we need, not the federal government isn't here to help. We saw the same thing in Florida, the same thing in Georgia, because the model that Thad Allen brought in for Katrina and then used in the Gulf oil spill for response to risks, for immediate response to risk, is one that everybody trains on now. Puerto Rico is a different story. It's fraught with politics, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to the criticism of You're starting to hear in Puerto Rico, not FEMA's doing everything they can to help us, but they think we're an island nation as opposed to a part of the United States. So there's a little different circumstance going on down there. We'll watch that very carefully. One of the things I learned when I was doing budgeting in the federal government, we were about to have a government shutdown, another existential risk, a potential shutdown. I learned sign language. Train, wreck. Take that off, nothing else but train, wreck. And all the while we operate in this environment that is totally politicized, where we have a budget and a debt limit till somewhere around Christmas time, because Donald Trump had a Chinese dinner with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. It's no way to run a railroad, sorry. No way to run a railroad. So as we deal with our risks, we have to manage the scope of the risk, we have to manage the politicization of the risk, we have to manage the intensity with which public officials are criticized for the activities they undertake. I hope that I've wound in the answers to the second two questions after the first one. Thank you very much.
All the speakers were fantastic being on time. In fact, I think I was 2 minutes long and you were 2 minutes short, so together we did great.
Averaging.
So we have some time for questions. Mark?
I could just talk, I'm Mark here. I'm curious, I'm very sympathetic about everybody's remarks. I'm at the Federal Reserve, so I'm, the source of some of the bad stuff that the first two speakers talked about. But I'm particularly interested in model risk management, because in effect, I've been a model risk manager, and the Fed deciding that it had to follow its own guidance changed the way it did model risk management. So I'm no longer a model risk manager, and I think the system that was put in is likely to be less effective. But you guys deal with a lot more models than the Fed does, frankly. And so my question is, if you're going to do effective model risk management, where it makes sense to do it, right? I understand Ben's point about you got to be able to make the models really nimble. If you're going to do it, how do you do it? A compliance mentality, I think, is not effective, but if you're going to do it, there must be a systematic way that is not a compliance way. What would that way look like?
Well, first, Mark, I'd say I'm surprised that you don't think you have more models than we have, because under the definition of models under prevailing Fed guidance, this SR 11.7 that I referenced, anything that's an analytical process that results in a quantitative estimate is a model. So that would mean every analytical tool used by the FOMC, the research division, supervision, all parts of the Fed. I would guess, it wouldn't surprise me if you have at least 1,000 models in the inventory of what would be counted under SR, under the relevant standard. But in terms of how do you do good model risk management, I think this is sort of echoes benchmarks. One size doesn't fit all, right? You have to figure out what's the intended use of the model, what are the risks of the model, which vary widely. Can the model be easily kind of back tested? Is the model trying to predict, are we trying to predict the outbreak of war in the Korean Peninsula? Are we trying to predict movements in FX rates where we have hyper frequency data and can back test this very, very easily over very short intervals? And so, I think you really got to figure out what's the purpose of the model, and then to design an appropriate kind of validation or a monitoring process for it. And one of my frustrations with the guidance that's out there is it takes a very prescriptive and sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to all of these models, and I think that's the wrong way to go. So I think tiering models by importance, and then again designing specific approaches that work for validating or monitoring the performance of different types of models has got to be at the core of any successful model risk management approach.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Andy said. We have businesses that are sort of quantitative asset management. They look for signals that can generate alpha. And they had set up a peer review system, not so much to be focused on the mechanical elements of the model, but we wanted to make sure that if we were going to try to use these models to generate returns for our clients, that they should work. And they would have someone who was not the model creator basically sort of be like the team B and critique it. And they had, in that particular unit, they had a pretty collegial group, but they had an academic kind of sort of culture. So just like, you see very nice professors will tear each other to shreds when it comes to critiquing the papers. It's not personal, it's intellectual. They tried to have the same kind of approach for those types of signals. We have other models which we distribute through, we have a model vendor business where we provide models to third parties. And not surprisingly, when you have lots of clients who depend on models, they have their own ways of dealing with unreliable models, which is to fire you. So there's lots of regression testing that was done, and this was all before the regimes, model risk management sort of came to our organization. These were just sort of smart things to do. The challenge that you have, and again, we're very concerned with sort of timeliness of the models and how quickly we can react to changing circumstances. There were some models which our regulator pointed out that were models that were actually run by the risk management group itself and developed by the risk management group, and there was no one on top of the apex, that those models actually really weren't being subjected to that sort of second set of eyes, and we accepted those critiques that they were right. So we have certain models that we use at the enterprise level that, as the group responsible for the risk management activities, they went unattended, and we wound up finding we found other colleagues within our organization who had this subject matter expertise, and now we've chosen, well, we have to do it, but it's a smart thing to do also, to have those models looked at by this non-affiliated party within the organization. So different circumstances, different rules. To some extent, if you're trying to act in a market, and ultimately the success or failure of your activity is the governor, that's going to drive for a high degree of robustness. Now, that being said, there was a famous case not that long ago where a quantitative asset manager had a defect in the model, and they wound up having, I think, a $37 million fine. I'm not sure that was so much because they made a mistake in the model, but rather they covered up the mistake. And that's a different, so yes, it was a validation problem, but it wasn't that they didn't know the answer. It's just that they knew the answer and they were embarrassed. They basically tried to wave it off, and that's why I think they got the bulk of their penalty.
Thank you. Monique Mansura with MITRE. A follow-up question for Professor Stanton. You mentioned the role of OMB in managing on one side and allocating planning budgets on another. And you cited a couple of examples, the VA crisis and the Benghazi tragedy. Can you cite examples where allocation of budget where you saw a significant plus-up pre-crisis versus post-crisis. Any examples of that?
Oh, it's a great question, and I'm not sure that I have examples of anticipatory reserving for a contingency is basically what you're asking.
Or seeing a crisis, having data, having sort of Cassandra's calling, seeing a crisis, and having that result in the budget to mitigate the risk.
I think the one that I spent the most time on was Y2K.
Yes, that's a good one.
We brought John Koskinen back. I was the deputy director for management, and we brought John Koskinen back, and I ran the money side, and John ran the influence along the way. We probably spent about $2 billion roughly on updating agency systems. We didn't throw money at the problem. We went to Atlantic City. I shouldn't have said it. The technical center for the FAA is near Atlantic City, at an airport near Atlantic City. And they showed us the last spare part from their computers, which were then 20 years old, that IBM said they were no longer going to build them ever again. And they had one left. And so we realized that giving FAA some money for air traffic control, even on an interim basis, was important. We also spent money helping the Russians secure their nuclear stockpiles. So I think that was a case of anticipation, and John and I together, using some of Thad Allen's principles, built a network. We built a network of financial institutions to work with financial institutions on the problem. Chemical companies, energy companies, where the energy company and the energy department work energy companies work side by side to see what the risks were and try to develop a plan to mitigate.
But that said, government has a bad habit. If you have a reserve of funds that's a cushion or resilience or anything else, and somebody finds out about it, you're in serious risk of losing it.
So I have a question on the government side. So, I'm not an expert at this, but most of the agencies all have like an inspector general. So what's the role of sort of the inspector general relative to sort of risk management? So for example, Ginnie Mae is now being criticized for not solving the problem that they have too many non-bank servicers, which of course is the president of Ginnie Mae is the one who's been pointing out this issue for the last several years.
Oh, but the market's been developing. Ginnie will never, that's an external issue that Ginnie has no control over. But anyway, the answer is the inspector general. It's almost a 3 lines of defense model that the internal auditors came up with. Your first line is your manager who's running the program. They should be attuned to risks, whatever. Your second line is your independent risk function that plays a constructive role. It's a very difficult role. We saw that in the financial crisis. You don't want to be captured, but you want to be close enough so that you understand what's going on in the nuances. And then the third line of defense is the inspector general, who comes in and is no longer simply reporting to the agency head to try to make things work better, but has a mission of actually disclosing. The good inspectors general will play a constructive role. But the inspectors general are all over the lot in terms of what they do, and a number of them will not play a constructive role.
Thanks. This is a question probably for Tom and Ed also. I'm Dave Sideri. I'm with the Fed also. I'm on the operational side. I also spent some time at HUD as well as with the big banks. And my question's from when I was at HUD, I know we worked with education and ag and talked about the credit risk across the government and tried to look across the government. And we worked through some of that. It was very difficult. I remember thinking, wouldn't it be great if the government had a government-wide CRO? And my question to Tom and Ed is, do you think that the government would be better off with a government-wide CRA looking across all the different agencies?
I think absolutely, and it's Ed's categories, you know, of all of the really big bad stuff that can happen if you're not paying attention. I would also suggest, because my friends who are more methodologically attuned keep insisting, it's also lost opportunities, not really risk on the downside. But I think that would be really helpful. It would be a position that would have to build trust across the government. Because once again, you're relying on information flow from people who are a lot closer to the problem than that person will be, because there'll be so many layers up. But if they can establish a relationship of trust and sort of network relationships around the government, I think it would be a great idea. Not very staff intensive, but it'd be a great idea.
In 1992, John Glenn authored the Chief Financial Officers Act and said at his final day in the Senate that it was one of his greatest achievements. There were no requirements for audits in the for financial audits in the federal government on a government-wide basis. There were no chief financial officers. The CFO Act of '92 established that. They then created a network. Chief financial officers then created a network to set their own accounting standards, along with GAO and the Treasury. And the evolution of the CFO role has been very, very significant. I think we have the same opportunity here with the CROs. Once we start to get CROs in place, making sure that there is one in each agency, then bringing them together, having them work with some central person, probably in OMB, to create the kinds of rules and processes they need to do is a really good idea.
A couple of years back, the U.S. Treasury established a chief risk officer.
Right.
Fallon's job.
Yep.
Treasury is one of those departments with a lot of really strong barons. And it's hard for information to flow across some of those lines.
Hi, my name is Helen Yang, and my background is in fintech. So I have a question for Dr. Golub regarding the asset management. From a perspective of the general public, their biggest pain during a financial crisis is when they see their 401k becomes 201k. So the problem is the professionals always tell people to buy and hold, and they give that long-term spiel that you need to stay in the game, which totally does not make sense. And then would it make sense for, say, for investment managers, the providers of index funds and actively managed mutual funds, to actually more actively use cash as their way to manage the risk when there is a downturn, when the volatility is very high? Would it make sense for, say, the regulators to ease up the restriction on how much cash you can hold in your index funds? In a way, it's more or less like index plus funds. You know, you have, say, you have iShares S&P 500, and then when the volatility is really high, you maybe have 50% in the S&P 500. You have 50% in cash, so that the volatility is going to be lower.
Well, if a manager would know when the market was going to be going down, then certainly if you could do that, I mean, there's an infinity of research that there are many people in the room who can speak to much more than I can. But I mean, I think it's pretty well perceived to be best practice that trying to anticipate market downturns and to actively manage them is a risky activity. And there may be, certain managers who can empirically demonstrate that skill, but over the long run, that's not been proven out. So I think there is a problem that you're getting at, but I think the solution is quite a bit different. The problem is not that it goes down in value. The problem is that it is in the face of a retail investor, and they're seeing this transparency, and they're panicking. And there's lots of data that when retail investors trade their portfolios, sort of chasing returns and running away from risk, they dramatically underperform. In fact, some people argue that the alpha that exists in the marketplace is to a large extent the residual from the systematically bad trading that happens by the retail investor. So were you to try to fix that, I mean, in a sense, there's an old-fashioned vehicle like a pension fund, and a pension fund has the ability, it's got professional managers, and the beneficiaries don't necessarily see the fluctuations because it's not on a mark-to-market basis. For most people, they're not paying attention to that, so they're not trapped into making those mistakes. But the formula that you're describing is a formula that it's like the fountain of youth. People are searching for it forever, yet people still get older.
So it is true that nobody can predict the prices, but we do have good volatility data. Would it be fair to say for an investor who is buying into an iShares S&P 500, because of the historical volatility is 17, one would say, I can feel comfortable, say, up to 20 or 25. When the volatility goes higher than that, which we know, we can look at the actual volatility going back, or we can look at forward-looking volatility such as VIX to say now if it's hitting 30 and 40, now it's time to reduce the exposure.
I mean, there are products that target volatility. My firm manages some of those. Again, the challenge is whether following those volatility filter rules necessarily operate well. Now, on case-by-case basis, let's say you are a retiree and you're living on your savings, and the market volatility gets to the point that you're getting to where you no longer have ability to take risk, and then you're sort of taken out of the risk-playing elements of the market. And on an individual level, someone might say, look, I'm now at the point where I have no more risk tolerance. I have to leave the market. I can think of a story of an 80-year-old woman who had a portfolio, and this woman had her own way of doing things, and at 80 years old she had 120% equity exposure. She seemed to think that was a good idea. And when the financial crisis occurred, and she suddenly was literally down to about half. She said, what should I do? And I said, well, you've lost your ability to ride out the next economic cycle. You probably need to leave the market, because if you go beyond that, you can't eat and you can't pay the rent on your apartment. But that's a very specific thing based on a specific circumstance of a particular investor. But you can have high-risk products and low-risk products. You can have target date funds. There are many things which are designed to taper risk in a rational way. But I'm not aware of any surefire algorithm that would govern how to manage a portfolio for a mass market.
Thank you.
And I think with that, we're exactly on time.
Well, we are exactly on time. I was going to let you take one more question if you wanted to, but
Okay, Bernie?
Bernie, you have to know.
If you want to take, so Ed, I have a question on your comment with respect to the student loan, and also with respect to the risk, the risk management. So I think the comment was made that banks were charging so much money, they're making so much money on student loans, and the government could do that and lower the cost. But in a market where the price of risk is somehow embedded in the cost of that, i.e. the interest rate, if you're making an unsecured loan to somebody who doesn't have a job and no assets, I mean, it has to be a higher interest rate, especially if we know that credit cards are similar loans that charge high interest rates. So for the government to take that risk and not charge for it, to simply lower the cost, it doesn't seem that that's the sort of application of, correct risk management tools.
I think that's right. And but what they did, just to be clear, is they used the low cost of borrowing of the federal government, putting a margin on that for the student loan. That margin was intended, and it's proven to be the case so far, to actually make a profit for the federal government, which it has done so far. So the cost to the student was reduced because you used the borrowing rate of the federal government as opposed to the cost of funds rate of a bank. The banks were taking their cost of funds, putting a margin on them, and the federal government was guaranteeing those loans along the way. Now the loans are direct loans where there's an increment that Congress establishes on top of the cost of money to the U.S. Treasury, and that increment is designed to recover the cost of the program and take care of the risk elements that are there. I haven't gone through the model in a long time. There may be people who have. I don't know how good it is.
We can go,
I don't know how good it is.
I would tell it different. I just can't help it.
Go ahead. I encourage you.
So I completely agree with you on the basics, but what was going on with the federal student loans is that the federal government was taking essentially all the risk in either case.
Yes.
Under the guaranteed loan program, Congress had actually set rules that were quite generous to the banks. So just as a matter of administrative costs, when the government went to direct lending, they were still taking all the credit risk, but they were able to effectively have lower administrative costs because they were taking out what they had put in that really probably shouldn't have been there to begin with. So it did reduce the cost of the program. As to whether the government isn't losing money, that's a longer debate where I would take the other side. So, but
And I'm happy to do that. I don't
but we
have-
won't do that right now
Right,
because
sorry.
it's time. We can do it over drinks, but let's thank the panel very much for a very nice discussion.
Good job, guys.
that was great.
And the location of dinner and drinks is actually in the other tower of this hotel. I don't even know if I'm pointing in the right direction. I think I am that way. And so we're just going to migrate over there and continue the conversation. Thank you.